This book, it occurs to me that I am American, which I edited. I just want to say a little bit about it, which is that maybe like many other people, the morning after the election, I woke up and I thought, what can I do? You know, that was after picking myself up off the floor, and I thought, well, the only thing I can really do is I know a lot of writers, I know a lot of artists, and I'm going to reach out to them and see if they'll do something. And that's what happened. And I want to give credit to Touchstone Simon & Schuster, who bought this proposal and made this beautiful book. If you haven't seen it, the ACLU, who signed on to be the beneficiary. I didn't exactly sign on. I think we signed them on. But you know, the big thing was that I said to people, I don't want political essays. We have enough political polemic and argument and noise. Write a story, write an original story, do an original piece of art, look at the things that are bothering you, talk about civil liberties, talk about immigration, talk about race, talk about the title, what it means to be an American now. So with that intro, I want to also say that there's 52 contributors to this book from people like who I will mention Philip Gourevitch, who's here, Lee Child again, Walter Mosley, but there's also Julia Alvarez, Russell Banks, Stephen L. Carter, Roz Chast, Louise Erdrich, Eric Fischel did a beautiful painting, you know, Neil Gaiman, Joyce Carol Oates, you're getting the picture, you know, Art Spiegelman. It was amazing to have these people just say yes. I will say that Russell Banks said, you know, I haven't been able to write since the election. So when you called, I thought, oh, okay, now I can write. And Angela Flournoy said to me, I had asked her, why did you say yes to this? And she said, it must have been something horrible that happened the day you emailed me, you know? And so she writes a kind of incredible story. We've been asked to talk about sort of violence in America and violence in literature, and we will. But I also want to say, if you think about a story like Angela Flournoy's, which is about slave quarters that are behind a university, it's a story about a kind of violence and history of slavery, but she writes it about academia, and they're arguing how to present it. And so she makes it a very funny sort of parody. So I am going to ask these folks sort of some of these questions, and then we'll just move around. But so, you know, we're talking about violence. I will say that, by the way, the stories in the book are not necessarily violent. There are stories that deal with some violence, but I wouldn't say that's the overall. But in this historical moment, I mean, you know, with the Parkland shootings, with the issues around gun control, I wonder if any of that idea about violence affects your work, or if we should never self-censor ourselves while we're writing. And anyone can take that. Don't look at me like that, Walter. Just answer the question.
My father told me a story once. He lived in Fifth Ward, Houston, Texas, which is a very tough place. More black people died there than died from his troop in World War II, and which is why he left Fifth Ward. But he was down in Galveston with some friends, and they'd been partying all night, and it was, you know, Sunday morning. They were driving back in this giant car. There was 4 guys. 3 of them were sleeping, and one of them was awake, and he was driving the car. And what happened was another car passed him and then got in front of him, and then another car moved up behind him. And he said, hey, guys, I think something's happening here. And, you know, sure enough, the guy in front hit the brakes, and then he got out, and the other guy got out with their guns. But there are 4 guys in this car. They didn't know it. And they, you know, just threw open all the doors and came out with their guns. And the guys went, oh, shit. And they jumped in their cars and drove away. I remember my father told me that story. It's like there are those moments where you really, like, you know, you're really happy that you're not going to get beaten, you know, robbed and shot.
Did you ever write about that story that your father told you?
No, it's just, you know, sometimes some things you just like to have in your head.
Or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I liked it. You know, but you know, it's that thing. It's that ambivalence about, you know, protecting yourself and also, you know, worrying about what that might mean.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I'm trying to. I'm not. It's funny because I think that I think writers tend to be vampires, which is why I asked you that question. I always think it's very dangerous to tell writers anything, but all of you have written about violence in one way or another. I mean, Lee is a nonfiction writer. Almost exclusive. Fiction writer, almost exclusively. You're a nonfiction writer, almost exclusively, though you wrote you used to write more fiction and you wrote something for here, and you've written both, Walter, right? So I don't know. I mean, this is a question that was given to me, but, how do we deal with, let's say, actual violence versus fictional violence, and is there a difference, and why are we drawn to violence? What do we want to do with that in books? I'm looking at you, Lee.
Well, I mean, obviously the difference between real violence and fictional violence is that the real violence happened, and the fictional violence did not. It's made up, and I'm a bad person to ask about violence because my books are very violent. I saw an online description of my series that said, "This is a detective series where the detective commits more homicides than he solves." And that's kind of true. But over the years, and before I was a writer, I worked in television, and we had sort of ethical and litigious issues about to what extent should we portray violence. Is it encouraging it? Is it likely to become copycat? And I've sort of brought some of those thoughts to what I write, and I think actually, and I hope that I'm not being self-deluding in terms of letting myself off the hook, but I think that the fiction audience actually has a very sophisticated response. First of all, we got to remember that the book readers are a fairly small subset of the population as a whole, sadly, and one would probably guess that book readers are possibly more informed or more educated or whatever than the population as a whole. So I think we can see that the response coming from book readers is not necessarily a generic response. And I believe that people read, in my case, these are basically mysteries or thrillers where there's a problem that then needs intensive investigation or something, and then it is solved. And the solving is very much why people want to read the book, because they want compensation or consolation for their regular life in which nothing gets solved. Right. As we know, regular life is most unsatisfactory. There's almost nothing works out, and when things go wrong, then there's nothing you can do about it.
They stay wrong.
They stay wrong. If you're tonight while you're here, if your car gets ripped off, you're never going to see it again.
You're trying to get everybody to go outside and check? Yeah.
If while you're here, your apartment is burgled, you're never going to see your stuff again. Real life never has any closure, never has any satisfaction, and it's a sort of dreary buzz of frustration that most people feel in their lives. And so for the sake of compensation, consolation, empowerment somehow, you want a fictional story where some really bad thing happens, and then some really determined man or woman comes along and solves the problem. And then you end up at the final part of the book, what do you do with the bad guy? Now, of course, in real life, what you do with the bad guy, he's arrested, and then you write another thriller for the legal thriller, which is his trial. And then you write another legal thriller for the appeal. But you've got to have an end to it. So the end sequence of the book is traditionally, not just me, but a lot of writers, at the end of the investigation, this huge climatic scene, and the bad guy is cornered, and the bad guy always ends up dead. In my case, Reacher will shoot him in the head. In fact, that just happened yesterday, actually. Somebody, for this year's book, I'm at a scene where there's this guy who is really just a very evil guy, and Reacher gives his victim the opportunity to shoot him, and she won't. She just can't bring herself. So he said, I just wanted to give you the opportunity, because otherwise you'd be wondering about it the rest of your life. And he says, you're a good person, Patty. And she says, thank you. And he says, better than me. And he shoots the guy in the head. And that, to me, is an awful thing to do. I would probably never shoot a guy in the head. But I know that...
You mean there's some doubt there, because you said probably.
Well,
Probably.
and the people that, you guys, people that would read my books would not do it either. But you get a tremendous amount of satisfaction because for once there's a simple solution. It's black and white. It's done. You have closure. The bad guy is punished. He does not have a 9-year appeal sequence before he's convicted.
Yeah.
He does not have, he doesn't escape on a technicality. It's done. And I think people who are absolutely nonviolent, people that believe entirely in the civilized values of society, still get a lot of satisfaction from that somehow, that in the fictional world at least something is done. And I think in a funny way, the fact that people enjoy it in fiction is almost proof that they know they can't have it in real life. Otherwise, why would they love it so much in fiction if it was something available in reality?
Yeah.
So I hope that I'm not being self-exculpatory in saying that, even though I make a living writing about extreme violence, I don't think I'm promoting it. I'm not writing a textbook for how to live. In a way, I think it's a relief, it's a safety valve, and I think people can consume violent books without being violent people. Sure. I think very often it's exactly the non-violent people love violent books because it is something that deep down in some atavistic way they crave, but they're so thoroughly civilized they know they should never have it, so they have to enjoy it.
Well, you know
secretly.
how they say the crime fiction world is a very kind and gentle world because they're getting it all out on the page, apparently. You know, it's something. But I was thinking that, you know, your book about Rwanda, the first book, I know you're writing a second one, was a book that actually had me crying very often. And yet, as you're reading it on the page, it still there's this distance because you're reading it. It becomes, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it was a great entertainment to read while I was, you know, horrified by it. So, and you went and did that in the trenches, so to speak.
Well, it wasn't really trenches, it was the aftermath. But I mean, I think one difference between writing about so-called real violence and fictional violence, because obviously fictional violence is realistic, fictional violence is what one's aspiring to, is that when you're writing about real violence, at least in my case, I tend to try to play down the gore. Or certainly when you're writing about something like the Rwandan genocide, you know, so you're looking at something where it's incredibly graphic violence. It's very immediate, it's intimate, it's intense, it's neighbors killing neighbors with handheld instruments and so forth. But what interests me is not like, wow, like the splatter of what might make a certain kind of crime movie or a Tarantino movie exciting, right, for some people, but rather like, okay, so here you have a whole society convulsed in this way. These are not people in any interesting way different from us. They were in a political situation that drove them to this particular precipice, and then they had agency and they behaved this way. It's now they have to live with it. What's that about? But in order to understand what it means to live with it, you also have to understand what it really was. And if you gloss it too much, if you simply say, well, so-and-so said that 20 members of his family were killed, that's one thing. But if you then follow the story for a while and so-and-so starts to find out, because so-and-so was probably in hiding if they were alive enough to tell you that 20 members of their family were killed, what in fact happened to them? That starts to rile them up and re-traumatize them in other ways. And then it starts to feel like, well, I now have to write about some of this graphic violence, sometimes really quite horrible stuff. And from my point of view, it's also a question of just, you say it was an entertainment. I don't know about an entertainment, but I want this to be I'm writing about a repellent subject. I don't want to write a repellent book. I want to write a book that draws you in and that makes you think about things around it. And if I give you too much of what is actually hard to take and hard to look at, it's harder to see the people again, right? And hear them again if you do that. So there's a question of mediating that. But I would just say this is hardly, I'm talking about Rwanda, but it's hardly an American theme or in literature. I mean, if you just go back and you think about things like the Iliad,
Right.
you know, every 2.5 pages. There's, the spear went in his anus and came out his throat, and he went down in a cloud of darkness. Boom. And there's actually one of the books of the Iliad ends with a sentence, something like, or I guess it's a verse, something like, and they went on killing each other. It's like that. You look at Sophocles, you look at Dostoevsky, you look at Camus, you look at wherever you look, because violence is an intensifier and accelerator of human dramas.
Right.
And although for the most part, we don't have a lot of murders in most of our families, those are the stories in which a kind of crystallization of a whole lot of relationships can take place.
Yeah, I think
And
it's
moral
Joan,
dilemmas.
Yeah, I think it was Joan Didion who says in one of her essays that the statistics were that murder is usually a family member, and it made her think twice about those Christmas dinners, But I was thinking that, Walter, you do both, fiction and nonfiction. But, we're talking about how books are structured. You still have to structure it, as you said, and make it readable. And so do you think totally differently about that? In fact, backstage, you were talking about when we talked about violence and murder and bullets, and you had some interesting comments.
I did.
Yeah.
I forget.
We'll
I was
make them up
backstage,
now.
and we were drinking. It's so interesting to me about trying to figure out in your work what violence plays and what it plays for people. A lot it's a metaphor. Lots of metaphor, even in the newspaper, even in nonfiction. It's something that you talk about. I haven't in my nonfiction, I haven't dealt with violence too much, but I did entertain a question once about in my last book, wondering about, well, if I could kill all the rich people in America, would that make open the path for freedom and democracy and equality among people? Now, and if I were absolutely convinced that was true, wouldn't I have to entertain that question? Wouldn't I have to wonder, well, should I kill these people? Not because I don't like them, and not because they did bad things, not because they had sex with my wife or something, but because if I kill them, it'll make it better for everybody else, And it's an interesting notion. Like if you think, God, I'm here, Hitler's there. If I kill him, maybe this stuff won't happen. All right, maybe. And if you didn't have to consider it, what would happen? And in considering it, you have to think, yes, maybe I would do this.
You see, that's the stuff of novels as well as nonfiction.
Life.
Considering
there's not a lot of difference between fiction
no, I
and
know.
nonfiction.
Because we all make choices when
yeah.
we're writing that. So, I don't really think it's just interesting because there's choices of what you leave in, what you leave out. I have all of these questions about the myth of violence, but basically I wanted to ask each of you, because some of you have some violence or an act of violence or something that has to do with, that occurs in your work. So I'll just start with Lee. Your story, New Blank Document, in Occurs to Me, is about a black expat and a sort of secret hate crime. I believe it's sort of based on a true story, but I'm not sure if you could talk about that a little.
Yeah, it's based. The incident was, as far as I know, absolutely true, and I read it in a book called "The Devil in the Grove" by a guy called Gilbert King, and it was really a book about Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP in the 50s. That climactic era when NAACP was doing. They had 10 years of extensive achievement, and the book is really about that, centered around a case in the South called Groveland, where typically 4 or 5 black teenagers were falsely accused of a crime and imprisoned and so on. And the incident that I picked out was just a small throwaway thing that did not relate at all to the main case. It did not relate to what Marshall was doing. It was just an incident along the way. One of the most horribly cruel and meaningless lynchings, really, that I've ever heard of. Just a really disgusting thing. A 15-year-old boy, not quite all there mentally, was lynched, drowned, not hung or burned. He was drowned, and his father was made to watch. And his father, the kid was saying, "Dad, help me," and the father was saying, "I can't. I've got 4 more at home." And the very fact, it was a minor point of the book. It was a minor point of the 50s struggle, and the very minoreness of it just struck me. Plus the fact that it was just before I was born. I mean, this is almost in my lifetime. And so I wanted to write about that one very small incident, but then I also wanted to write about, I hypothesized that this guy had an elder brother who had been a jazz pianist, and like a lot of black pianists and a lot of black musicians, went to Paris after World War II because it was easier and pleasanter to make a living there. And he was celebrated in France in that very French way. The French they love black Americans, the fact that they go to France to be free. And yet this guy never said in his whole life anything about what happened to his little brother. And that struck me as, being an immigrant, being a foreigner, that struck me as germane as well, because what I do find in America, I've been here 20 years, I've got really close friends. I've got really, these are smart liberal people that I know. And yet there is still a reluctance amongst Americans to really criticize the nation. I had dinner with a couple of people not long ago. We've known each other for 15 years, and there are certain things that you cannot say because there is something deep down inside them, even though these people are immaculately left-wing, they are immaculately ideological in every way. There are certain things that are still too raw somehow.
Well, maybe it's because some of them think that their own moral authority derives from an idealization of America.
Exactly.
That theirs would be diminished.
Exactly.
If you diminish the nation too much, then what are you? You're just like all the other schmucks on earth.
Yeah, exactly. That they need the exceptionalism thing in order to bolster themselves to some extent. Whereas I believe, from observing the rest of the world, it actually works in reverse. That the nation becomes exceptional because of the quality of the inhabitants rather than vice versa. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to try and capture that insane reluctance to actually, in my story, and the elder brother thing is completely made up. Here's a guy who has every opportunity in Paris, because obviously the French journalists are forever wanting him to criticize America. Because, post-war Europe was intensely jealous of America, which is why so much of it came out as bitter opposition. The French were always disdainful. The British were always resentful of America, and it's because they were enthralled by this immense mega power. They were jealous of it, and they would have wanted this guy to say every negative thing possible, but he wasn't going to, because even in his doubly disadvantaged situations, first, he was black himself, secondly, his family member had been murdered, he still wouldn't say it. And that was something that totally fascinated me.
It was so interesting. I was in France about 17 years ago. Doing some kind of book tour, and we were talking about America, and so this woman kept asking me about America, and she said, "Well, it's this and this," and I would say, "Well, yeah, there's racism. It's like this, works like that, works like that," and then she said, "Oh, it's very racist in America, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And she goes, "We're not like that here." And I said, "Well, from my understanding, the Africans, especially Muslim Africans, seem to have a lot of trouble with you guys, and you don't." And she said, "That'll be enough now." And they turned off the radio show. It was like so wonderful. I was like, "Really? Like you're just gonna stop it in the middle?" And she did. She did. That was it. She left.
But
they're very much like that. This is a typical thing where they'll sort of pound you with various information about America's abuses overseas.
Yeah.
Right? And I'll say, yeah, sure enough. Where'd you get that from? The American press, right?
Mm.
Right.
And meanwhile, how about like the French in Rwanda, the French here and the French there?
Algeria.
You guys don't even touch that. You don't even ask those questions of your own Secret Service.
Right.
Your investigative journalists, for the most part, won't touch it. It's an understood thing that this is not on. The establishment doesn't touch the establishment. But what a feast to like come over here, read our newspapers, and go like, ho ho ho, look at you, you know?
Yeah.
And so it feeds into this weird kind of anti-Americanism where then one does get one's back up, and you say, well, wait a minute, your anti-Americanism is feeding off also something that's kind of cool about America, which is that we tell these stories about ourselves. Now, maybe they don't actually serve as the corrective we'd like to imagine that they would, but at the very least, give us some credit for having produced that stuff and for being the source of your mockery or trying to cut us down a peg.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, but all the more frustrating because we are almost getting there and never quite arriving.
Yeah.
Well, I remember fighting with a French friend over that same kind of thing, where you suddenly become so American that you're defending things that you have, you've never said in your life because they're attacking America in this way. And I always then end up saying,
do we also not do that in a partisan way within America? Because
I know.
I try to be an extremely. I try wherever possible to be extremely empirical and data-driven, and there are certain things that are very, very interesting. For Parkland, Florida, and so on. There are 2 counties I just read about in Florida where they have what they call concealed carry, which means that you're permitted to carry a concealed handgun, called a CCL, concealed carry license. And in these 2 Florida counties, CCL owners commit fewer crimes than the police department in those counties. Now that is data that confuses the argument. And yet when we talk to each other internally, we take positions, we defend our position.
Maybe the cops are ready to shoot you if they don't know if you're carrying a weapon.
Well, I was thinking, it's not a big thing to commit less crimes than the police. If you committed less crimes than other people who didn't have CCL, then the police is that, and it is true. I mean, I don't know, I think I was saying back there that.
But to say the police commit crimes mean they've been prosecuted and convicted, which is a huge.
But not to me. The police commit crimes.
Yeah, but the data, if the data shows that the police are committing X number of crimes, they're actually committing far more because they're not prosecuted all that often.
I think that's what Walter was sort of right.
Well, it's like watching a guy, shoot the guy, like be on top of the guy and shoot him in Louisiana. Louisiana said, well, there's no reason to bring him to trial. Or it's like shooting the guy for having a cell phone in the backyard when somebody in front were breaking things. Or, and there's like 1,000. I mean, that happens every day, and it happens by the police. I've had guns pulled on me 5 times in my life, and it was always the police who pulled guns on me. I mean, nobody else has ever pulled a gun on me. Why would they? But the police are like pointing guns at me, and really, honestly, I'm like I am right now. I was never threatening them. Luckily, I didn't have a cell phone. It's like it was before cell phones.
That's lucky.
But it's a notion. Like though, when I think when you watch a guy, the police are on top of him with their knees in his chest and his head, and then they shoot him. The first thing you think is, well, God, if I was that guy, what would I like? And you say, well, I would like a gun. And the anti-gun thing kind of just flits right out of my head. I think, well, God, I need to, people need to protect themselves. That's the Second Amendment is an interesting thing, and so the problem is that you have it's polarized. You have people who want guns and people who don't want them to have guns, and nobody wants to figure out what the problem is. I think that's what you're talking about. Well, what's the problem? What's the issue? Why, when I lived in Vermont for 7 years, did every single person in Vermont have a gun, and nobody ever got shot? Why was that?
Because it's Vermont.
Yeah. But
I'm going to bring this back just for a minute to individual stories because and I will find a way to relate it because it's true. In Walter's Between Storms, which I should say, Walter was such a good scout that it was the first story that was turned in. But it's very complicated.
And it's all bad.
That's right.
So, well, I won't discuss whose was
I want their
last, but-
numbers. What number was it? Oh.
No, they know. They know. No,
I bet
no,
mine was
I won't
last.
say it. But in your story, I mean, it's this guy kind of goes nuts, and is sequestering himself in his apartment in between a storm in New York. He gets, it's climate change, it's social media, everything gets turned upside down, and there's a kind of impending violence all over the place. People breaking in, or then there's people helping him and drilling through the walls. And where did that all come from?
Well, I mean, as we said back there, it originally comes from Bartleby the Scrivener, where you have somebody who does the kind of like the ideal American thing, which is to resist.
Yeah.
He's not resisting, even consciously. It's not politically. It's not socially. It's not consciously. It's just after the hurricane hits New York, and the news just like is pounding you with how terrible, how many people are going to die, what's going to happen, how the terrorists are going to come in, because our defenses are down, all this other stuff. You finally says, I can't go out there anymore. I can't deal with this shit anymore. I can't do it.
But you turn your guy into an inadvertent hero too. Like this, he becomes this social media darling that he doesn't want to become.
Kind of like a hero, but more like, even though they wouldn't use the word, more like a metaphor. Like he feels like I feel. I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid when I get up in the morning, I go out in this world, and the news is like making me afraid. Like it's structured to make me afraid of my own life, afraid of the world, afraid of the weather, afraid of everything. And so that becomes the notion, is that it's not that people thought he was great or that he was sexy or that he was wonderful or anything, or smart. They thought, yeah, that guy feels the way I feel. Yeah. I wish I could stay in my house and never go outside again, because otherwise people are going to kill me. I know it. I read about it every day.
Yeah, that's why I don't listen to the news anymore.
Me neither.
But Philip, in Unaccountable, I'm not going to ask you if it's where you derived it from and how much is true, but it feels like
it's fiction.
No, I know it's fiction, and I know I.
It is made
No,
up.
but it's in a sort of war-torn country. It seems to be, there's a love affair. There's a duel in it, an actual.
I've not fought any duels.
No. Okay.
Did you win the ones
with
you
pistols?
fought?
Yeah. No, but it's a kind. But it seems to me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, about love and power and what happens in wartime. And
well, it's more. I guess it is, but it's about. The title Unaccountable. It's a little bit about this guy. He's an American, some low-level guy at the embassy in a country that is a sort of American client dictatorship of some kind, and he has a car accident and encounters is sort of helped out by a woman from the ruling elite in some way. She's an important person, and then they have an affair. And exactly cause and effect is not totally clear in any of this.
But what you're leaving out is that in the accident, he kills someone.
Right.
And that is the unaccountable person.
Well, he becomes
Or
the unaccountable person because
he's
she
not
sort of
held
says,
accountable,
this is a term in the country for the people who are the people who kind of blow through the world and not really have to account for anything.
Yeah.
They're the unaccountables, and the people in the black Mercedes, who sort of move in their own lane. And she looks at him and she's like, and he's sort of trying to be this. Well, he's a kind of dopey, humble American, like low-level guy. And he's like, gosh, I should get out and deal with this and everything. She's like, just get back in your car and get out of here. And he feels bad about that and everything. And she's like, come on, you're an unaccountable. And it's recognizing that in part. But also, he's not in any power position at any moment in that whole story.
No, he isn't, but you think he is. I mean, you kind of make the reader think that he
gets
is.
a ride on being the American guy.
On who he is.
On sort of being this American guy. But then he has this affair with her where he's not at all aware of what else is going on in her life and sort of where he fits in.
And isn't that all of us? I mean, don't you think that like
Yeah, I
all
don't
these
think it's
people are
particularly
dying?
American predicament.
Well, but like there are all these people dying everywhere. I remember as a kid watching the news about, they would tell me how many VC and Vietnamese that we killed, you know.
Every night at dinner.
And, you know, and right, and I'm paying, and you know, and I'm not really connecting the fact that, well, I'm paying taxes, and I'm not like talking out against this at that time. You know, I mean, that becomes a thing. It's he's like us, right? Or at least that's what I'm thinking. You know.
Well,
It's like,
yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of the thought when you were talking about earlier, when you were sort of like violence and do we do it ourselves or do we fictionalize it? You know, we're all the beneficiaries of monstrous violence on a daily basis, and you know, every once in a while, somebody in America will decide to have a tax strike so that they won't. You know, I'm not going to pay taxes to support. Yeah, but you know what? You're basically expecting that people aren't going to come marauding through your place. You know, you can move to Vermont and stop paying taxes and live off your organic farm and all that and everything. But guess what? You're not actually expecting that somebody's just going to come through and like steal your stuff and eat your stock and rape you or enslave you or carry you off or what have you. And
I'm
that
not
if they do,
terrified,
you
but-
might call the cops, and the cops are projecting force for you. And so this nice
Well, for
life
some-
we
for
live,
some of us anyway.
and this idea that like, well, we have a free press, or we have a this, or we have a whatever it is, and you know, well, we're not. Why don't people behave like us elsewhere? It's because we're projecting monstrous force around the world, right? And we all don't have to serve in the military anymore. That belongs to a caste. We now have a military caste of people who are largely the children of people who go to the military. And that's taken care of. And it used to be that in the Vietnam era, there was an anti-draft movement, which was the anti-war movement, and now the anti-draft movement are the hawks, because they realized, guess what? We couldn't have the wars we want. We couldn't have a free hand we want if there was actually everybody giving their children to the military.
Right.
This is people who are, ours is not to wonder why, ours is but to do and die, and they go out there and they serve. And or they're using it as a social ladder to get out of poverty or to go to college, which is a real thing and a very good thing. This is no way to knock those who are in there. On the contrary, it's that the rest of us are getting a free ride. And so we can all be very clean hands and very shocked and very purist about our own sensibilities and sort of fine about those things. And meanwhile, a lot of force, a lot of massive violence is behind every comfort you enjoy. Let's just be clear about that. As the nonfiction writer on the panel.
It's true. I mean, it's absolutely true.
Well, it's fun. It's funny,
Historically and currently.
Well, you know, it strikes me because one of the things that I asked people to do when they write their stories was, what is making you nervous? What is making you anxious? And you tell this war story. You know, Walter has this story of this man who completely not only drops out of society, but builds the wall around himself, you know. So it's just, it's making me think of the tremendous differences within what makes people nervous about violence, or not even some of the things that aren't violent, that just are terrifying people nowadays, you know, that are in this book. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, you asked me like writing about Rwanda. Every time I go there now, people are like, what the hell is wrong with your country? I mean, these school shootings, this like, you know, the latest thing. Every time, what are you guys, nuts?
And this is when you're in Rwanda doing the...
You have this immense power, and you lay yourselves open to what most scares us, which is that your kid could go to school and get like massacred, or you could walk out the door in some like nut job. And here, and they also say, and there it's not even an ideology. I mean, the idea that people have the weapons to do this is an ideology, but most of the people who do this are.
What do you say to them when they ask you that, though? I mean, that
you're right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, because it's an interesting thing. It does seem.
I think they're right.
Like it does seem to be, like an attribute of capitalism, like in America. That you know, you can't have a news show unless people watch, and they can't watch unless they want to watch, and you can't. Therefore, you can have advertisers. Then, therefore, you can do this and that. And so people are drawn into a thing. So, well, what we need, the best thing to do is either get them horny or frightened, you know. And so we get people horny and frightened, and then they go out and shoot people, and it's just like, it kind of makes sense, that.
But they're horny, frightened people elsewhere, and they don't go out and shoot people.
But I think that one of the problems though is that if it's an absolute system of how what you can be presented, what you can see, what you can experience, then and the freedoms that we enjoy in that. I think that there is a difference, that I don't think it's us. I don't think it's it's genetic. I don't think it's atmospheric. I think that it's actually a system that controls us, and that either we move away from, or we accept. I mean, we don't really have much more choice.
But it's also hardware.
Meaning to say?
It's guns and ammo. I mean, in most other countries, that's just not accessible in the same way to
but
civilians. And so people, it's not that they don't have bonkers people, and you hear about some guy in Siberia who goes nuts and stabs 25 people, which is kind of incredible. Chris Rock actually has a pretty funny routine about how do you stab 25 people? Like, can't people run?
One at a time.
No, but like after the third or fourth person, what are they, running towards the guy or just like waiting for him to stab them? But, but nevertheless, okay, if you walk into a school with a machete and it's like small children and you're a berserk Siberian lunatic, yeah, probably you can kill a lot of people. But it doesn't happen very often.
Well, it's interesting that you're saying this while you're interviewing people in Rwanda. And you're going.
But that's politically organized.
As opposed to
none of those people were breaking the law at that time; they were obeying it.
But that's even there is kind of a perverse, more than a perverse.
Well, no, but that's a kind of war logic. In other words, it's not like it. I mean, even if it, but the Nazis who were working as camp guards were maybe mass murderers, and quite often probably the people who dug it and got into it and discovered a taste for it were the ones who moved forward and became the more regular people, but they were doing it with license. They were doing it, and the question is, like in Rwanda, one of the other things is in Rwanda they've released a whole lot of mass murderers, and they put them back in their communities. And what is here, people flip out. Here we are much more punitive system. But there are no forgiveness.
There's other issues in Rwanda. I mean, I remember watching one guy get interviewed, and they said, well, why did you kill, the woman said, why did you kill my family? Mm-hmm. And he said, because they promised me I would have a farm if I killed your family, and they didn't give it to me. He was really upset that he can get it. Sure. I think that whether or not somebody has given you license, you have to make that decision. And I'm not saying that you should be tried for that decision. I'm saying making the decision is an interesting thing. And like we were saying,
but
backstage,
that goes together. I mean, the reward is part of what I'm talking about with a license. In other words, you weren't prohibited. Yeah. You were encouraged, right? And the question is, if that person is removed from an order that will reward that, and he's told, this is totally prohibited, man, you will never get away with this, is he going to be what our sort of Western idea of the murderer, compelled to kill again, like the psychopath who must serial kill at any cost? No. In fact, most of these people do not turn out to be, even if they will openly tell you they enjoyed it at the time, they do not turn out to be people who will do it.
But most of us don't either. I mean, most people in America don't do it either. I mean, the question is how things get structured, not like I mean, people are kind of like the same, I mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I think it is something to do with like the hardware. In other words, the hardware is a kind of license, or anyway, it makes possible something that would otherwise be extremely difficult.
Yeah, the hardware, but that's a fairly blunt way of putting it. I think the fetishization of the hardware, because like Walter talks about Vermont. I got a place in Wyoming where I'm certain everybody is armed,
of course.
But it is just considered unseemly to ever, brandish your way, show it off. This is an ancient culture where it is not fetishized, and
it's a tool.
It's a tool, and that is the point that I obliquely try and make in my books, because Reach is an ex-soldier, and he says never tell a soldier that guns are fun, and that's his point, that any suburban street anywhere around here, the sort of houses that have a garage or a basement, you can guarantee every single person's got an electric drill a Black & Decker. It's there. If they're conscientious people, probably they maintain it well or store it neatly or whatever, but it's
You've
there.
not seen the Brian De Palma movie, the old Brian De Palma movie. That's for certain. Yeah,
Some
in
of them have
case
DeWalt's.
in case they need it. And what I would want is, I mean, the thing I question is why does a certain section of the gun-owning public fetishize these things? I mean, you do not get websites dedicated to people drooling over Black & Decker drills. It's just not a thing.
I don't know.
It's it is a.
It's actually the most popular Father's Day gift.
I'll send you
God,
some-
no, I don't know.
I'll
but
send you some links.
It is. It is.
You ever seen tool company calendars? They're pretty kinky.
I've tried to. I stay away from any kind of manual activity, so I'm not really.
The calendars
not
don't
really
require
into that.
much,
But
yeah.
I mean, it's what bothers me about it is the guns are guns, but they're also simultaneously symbols. And at the moment, they are symbols of this tremendous partisan dispute we've got. And it's not just guns. Other things that are patently disgusting are equally, like, today, dumping mining waste in streams. That is now permitted again. Now, who on earth could think that is a good idea, objectively? I mean,
we know
Yeah.
who, but
no, but
very-
seriously, a profitable idea, an idea they selfishly
No,
want
they
to
like it
pursue.
because it makes
Yeah,
liberals mad.
Exactly. They will pick anything that makes liberals mad. So the guns is
They're
partly
crapping on
guns.
your lawn.
It is also partly crapping on your lawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they will push anything that makes us mad. And so to a certain extent, the gun issue is tied up with that dynamic, along with a lot of other things. I mean, a completely trivial and irrelevant quote from years ago, I remember Ann Coulter saying that she wanted 6-gallon toilets in every house in America. At the time when we were talking about saving water.
Saving water.
Just like
Yeah.
leave the tap running, basically.
Yeah, it's inconvenient, it's this and that, it's a nuisance, but who can honestly think that wasting drinking water down the toilet is a good idea? It's patently not a good idea, but people are forced to support it because we're locked into this partisan struggle that picks on symbols. That I in my heart, I believe that they don't 100% support the symbol. They're doing it because it's a political argument simultaneously.
Yeah.
Well, it
No, I
doesn't
think
matter to them, I think. Yeah, just only what it means matters. What the reality behind it is something else. Yeah.
Well, it's and Lee, you may have heard this, but before this book came out on Amazon, months before it came out, there were all of these very, very nasty, negative things like, I'm never reading one of your books again, da-da-da-da. They have no idea what the book is about. They were all bots, as it
Because it
turned
was
out, and
ACLU.
Amazon had to remove them. But the thing, it's interesting because everywhere I went with this book, people would say, how do you get the other side to read it? And I said, well, how do you know that the book is that antagonistic necessarily to the other side? And this is a book to examine America and American ideals. So what makes you think that, Maybe this is a good time, though, to turn it over to you folks. If people, nobody with a gun, but people who have a question, sir.
Well, you talk about violence on the page.
Oh, wait, we have somebody with a microphone, right? We're just going to bring them to the.
You made that transition too quickly.
I know I'm very
Yeah.
fast.
Right here.
Right here.
You're very spontaneous.
I
just
am,
like that.
sorry.
As I was saying, so you talk about violence on the page, violence in reality. What about the other modalities? Violent video games, violence on cable. Are those similarly not encouraging of violence, but just things that people observe and it has no impact on them?
Well, I mean, I always think there's a very fundamental difference between reading and any other form of entertainment, in as much as reading is very participatory. If you're reading a book, it's actually literally your mental energy that's getting burned. It's your calories. Your brain is working at that point. And I think you're interrogating the text in a way that you do not get if you're consuming television or movies. It's much more of a one-way street. I think there is a crucial difference. And I think that portrayal of violence in movies and television is better now than it used to be. And, in the 70s, we had way more violent movies, and in Britain, certainly way more violent TV than now. I don't think TV has a massive effect. I do worry about video games because they are participatory. They're literally training a person into that into the mindset, and if it's a good game, graphically, literally into the physical position of hunting people down and killing them. And that does worry me, again, from the point of view simply of taste. I mean, who would enjoy that? To me, that's fundamentally incomprehensible. So I do worry about video games simply because that you're in the game. You're not either a critical consumer or a passive consumer of something. You're actually participating in it. And I think, that is weird to me. And I'm certainly not in favor of censorship or banning anything. I would prefer that common sense takes over. It's pretty vain hope. But these Call of Duty or whatever those things are, I think they're disgusting, and in all of those things, you just gotta think back to personal experience. I remember as a little kid playing soldiers, like you did. And my dad, who had served in World War II, never said much about it, but I remember at one point he said, we were playing as soldiers, dramatically being killed and all of that. He said, you would not be doing that if you'd ever seen it happen. And that element of reality is missing.
You said, well, what do they say in Rwanda when they about the guns here? I've also noticed that people there, nobody watches violent movies, but particularly, I mean, the stuff that's being seen or that people are talking about tends to be American comedies or international comedies. Sort of fun, a lot of music, a lot of entertainment. Romantic comedies and like stuff that makes you laugh, that makes you relax, that makes you so we sort of look at the fantasy of another life, right? I mean, it's not that there's no laughter. There's actually a whole comedy scene in Rwanda right now, but that's a different thing. And here I think some of the attraction to violent movies or to look at the westerns or whatever is a kind of fantasy about this simplified. I mean, what you were saying earlier also, it's simplified, it's starker, there's a kind of moral order, the bad guy gets it, a few good guys get it along the way, but hey, life's tough. And you think, you sit in your comfort and you kind of fantasize about a situation where, the family dinners exactly, right? Where it's just simple, you just waste them and move on and ride off into the sunset. And people get off on that. That's definitely something. But it's also understood to be a fantasy.
Yeah. Well, for some reason, I was reminded of some people might remember the critic Pauline Kael, who I thought was a crazy, wonderful critic. But she was writing about a very violent movie, and she said, "You can't spell out the dangers of neon with neon." It stuck in my head as a kind of great quote. But I just wanted to also say that when I wrote my first novel, which was a crime novel, which is 20-something years ago, my editor, a woman, said to me, "Why is that woman getting killed off the page? I want that woman killed on the page." Now, I just was sitting with a group of actually all women writers, Laura Lippman and Megan Abbott, and they were all talking about taking that particular kind, specifically taking that kind of violence out of their books. Whether or not, I don't know. I mean, I think that goes back to what we're saying about books. It goes away from your question somewhat, but I don't know that that changes things. Maybe it does. I don't know. We had a big discussion about it, but I'll take another question.
It's right there.
Oh,
May I? Okay.
yeah.
A common denominator to the use of violence in a creative effort is that it's titillating. And you guys certainly capture that in fiction and nonfiction. And I was wondering whether or not we as a society engage with that, or is it that are we different than other societies in that we go there with games, with books, with movies. It is part of our culture. And how different is it? Is it that way in Rwanda? Is it that way elsewhere? Is it a question of access to hardware, or are we a culture that engages because it's titillating with the use of violence?
Well, titillating only gets you halfway there. I mean, why? Why is it titillating? And as far as uniqueness in American culture, I think, actually, no. I think that I really, I like history, both short-term and long-term, ancient history, prehistory. I love imagining the flow. And the nonfiction writers and historians have a responsibility to set down the facts, and novelists then have the luxury of then imagining the feelings around those facts.
More fact and fiction than nonfiction, I believe. But
Yeah, and for, we talk about American culture. One of the questions that Jonathan previewed to us was, the founding myth of America, the violence of it, and so on. It always strikes me is that, on the morning of July 4th, 1776, people did not wake up new. They weren't given a new SIM card to insert in their brain. They were the same people as they were yesterday. And of course, there was a large political reorganization and a nationalist fervor and swelling and so on, and the United States was formed. But those people were fundamentally the same as they were last week and last year. They were British people, and they had been used to a very long process over many centuries of displacing other people, stealing their land, and so on and so forth. So I don't think there is anything particularly unique about the American founding myth of violence. I think it's a perfect continuation from everybody else's, stretching back centuries.
Also, the question becomes, it's a good way to talk about us, but of course, in 1776, we didn't wake up English because there was, Germans and Dutch and Native Americans and slaves and, people who weren't slaves. And, there's all kinds of people. And it's true in America today. There's all kinds of people in America. And one of the problems, that I keep getting back to is the media. And I think that what the media actually kind of says things that makes us seem like the same and really highlights the problem. Like anybody talking about Israel would say, well, the Israelis hate the Palestinians. If you go to Israel, that's not true. Most Israelis say, well, let's not like the Palestinians, they like me. But there are groups of people who who are causing problems. A lot of them are in control of the media one way or the other, either by owning it or by causing violence to make it listen to them because they like that. I think it's a really complex issue to say you can't say who we are.
I also think, I was thinking about foreign sales. Foreign readers who buy Jack Reacher books, we're not necessarily exporting our ideas about violence. I don't think. I think that they're reading them for same reasons that an American might be reading them, or there might be some other things there, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think they read them as guidebooks to America.
No,
the mind of America, really. But Israel's, to be completely blunt about it, Israel's problem is it's happening 100 years too late. If Israel had been founded in 1848, at the time that America was expanding through the West, there wouldn't be a Palestinian problem because they'd all be dead.
It's true. Marauding through the West is, it's true.
That was actually one of the most instructive things I've done recently was, for some reason, I rewatched the Ken Burns documentary, The West, which was, I don't know how old that is now, 20 or 30 years old, I think. And with all these arguments about white supremacy, what is that concept? And people talk about it in terms of black and white, which by now is such a dense and confused argument. Just set that aside for a moment. Watch that documentary series, The West, explicitly white supremacist, completely explicitly, written down in black and white from the government and every statement from every level of every person.
A very successful genocide.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And a lot more violence.
And that was...
a lot more violence.
Yeah, a lot more. And that was the thing that I was, the subject I mentioned earlier when I was talking to these two friends of mine at dinner. I was probably high or drunk or something, and I said, this is, that's I've adopted Michelle Obama's slogan for the next several years. When they go low, I get high. And
so you can stay there.
That must be pretty...
It's a great experience. And so that was the subject that came up. I said, basically, deep down, this country is built on slavery, genocide, and land theft. And that was too much. They just bristled at that point, which is...
Did they say it wasn't?
They kind of...
Well, a lot of people have come since and don't like to have to be saddled with that.
Yeah, a lot of people... what I found most people do is they switch subjects to, somebody else or some other aspect. And I'm British, and Britain is an older country, obviously, and has...
Son's the son.
Pardon?
Sun to sun.
Yeah, exactly. It has a long and disgraceful history around the world, and yet, in my parents' generation, they would never admit it, but now people in Britain are perfectly comfortable in saying, yeah, we fucked up big time, we screwed the world, it was a disaster. And is that just an artifact of maturity, age, time passing, or what? Will it happen here? I don't know.
I think it does to some degree, but I mean, I look at sort of my children's generation. I feel that more strongly. But do we have another question right here? This young woman right here had her hand up before.
Hi. I sort of have two questions, but I think that they form into one. I heard you kind of saying at the beginning, I think you were being funny, but you were saying, like life, there's no real satisfaction, and you never sort of get this, or especially particularly within like liberalism, you talk about like your ideal, immaculately liberal friends who never really find this satisfaction in the political arena, that I almost saw like play out between the discussion you guys were having about guns versus like hardware and this symbolism that they represent of something that's fetishized and, racialized like throughout the country, and how often in the political arena you never get sort of that like justice that's associated with metaphorical symbolism, metaphorical justice is associated with all those like bias that people have about certain issues. And so I was wondering like how you think, when you're writing about fiction, how do you think that you perpetuate that narrative of satisfaction and idealism without sort of going too far out of like the realistic stakes of government and facilitating legitimate justice, and the other side of like how do you also promote stories that don't get too gory, like you were saying before, but at the same time like hold people accountable, even though you sort of said that there's not really a true person who's accountable these days.
Isn't this what writers and artists do also, is make these choices all the time? But I don't want to answer for them. I wanted Lee to answer and also for Philip to answer that. I think it's a good question in terms of, but the choices that we make, what we may be perpetuating. I don't know that that's something we think about perpetuating, but Lee, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, if I say I'm worried about perpetuating violence, first of all, I feel a bit arrogant about that. Like, really, who listens to me? How much effect can I have on the world?
How many books did you sell your last book?
Yeah, right. But, it's still a big-headed thing to say. I must be careful about what I write, otherwise I'll cause chaos across the planet. That's a little bit too much. But I try. It's a very awkward balancing act, to be honest, because on the one hand, I try and be as realistic about it from, this is a weary military vet who has seen things that you wouldn't want to see, and he doesn't see any glamour whatsoever in violence. He doesn't see any glamour in owning weapons and so on. So I try and present that side of it. But then I know for a fact that people are loving those books because, and I say this a lot at book events, and I sincerely think it's true that all of you, even though you are super civilized people, all of you have a secret list of 10 people you would cheerfully shoot in the head. And we could probably get a consensus on the top few right now, and so I feel like that is a fact, There was a book by Nicholson Baker called The Fermata, where the conceit of that book was the world could just stop, everybody's just frozen in time, and you could do what you want. In other words, you could get away with whatever you wanted. If that was real, we would do stuff, would we not? And it's pointless you all denying it, because I know you would. And so that is kind of the tension that we're dealing with.
You want to say something there?
I'm going to go back to what Lee said earlier about fiction and nonfiction. He didn't say it about nonfiction, but it's true. That it's easy to kind of think of writers as being separate from people who read whatever they write. But the truth is that every time somebody reads a book or an article or a letter, they, as you said, take it in and make it real for themselves. And so it's a dialogue. And it's a dialogue that we're having. We're not having it, with words. We're having it, with language, but speaking words. But we're having it in our heads. And so one of the wonderful things about books is that people are in their heads having a dialogue with you, and the book is changing again and again and again. What they see, what they don't see, what they create, what they think, what the story means to them. Often I'm like talking to people, and they say things so much smarter about my books than I've ever thought. But it has become true about my book because they're thinking it, and it enters into the mainstream. And it would be almost impossible for me to take responsibility for me controlling these people, because I don't know what I'm doing. And and when I write these books, I'm not trying to say this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. I'm saying that this is what this guy did in this situation. And we may think it's right, we may think it's wrong. I might think it's right, may think it's wrong, but I think it's true to the character, because when I'm writing, I'm going to be true to the character. When I'm writing nonfiction, I want to be true to what the person did. Not try to guide you into thinking something else.
You were talking about, Philip was talking about giving not all the gore, but you can't also take it away and sugarcoat it. And I think that often, what was just said by Walter is too, that you might write this whole thing. If you're writing nonfiction, you have something else, but when you're letting a character go, usually it might be an editor that's told you, or later when you look over it, you decide to take some of that out. But when you're interviewing somebody and you're writing this all down, and I know you're doing this with your next book, when you have to make decisions as to what's going to engage your reader and what's going to turn them off or not work. Or
yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent you go scratching after what you're interested in, right? But then there certainly are experiences I've had where I've gone to meet somebody while reporting a story, and with no particular idea who they are. I mean, in other words, I know that they are connected to this story, and they're another person who was there at the time of an incident that I'm interested in, and they're the daughter of so-and-so and the sister of this one or so. But, you're not quite sure what they have to add, but I might as well check that box and go knock on their door and see what they've got to tell me. And you walk in there, and it's like, suddenly somebody starts talking. They start talking for 2, 3, 4 hours. And I'm thinking of a particular person, a young woman in one in this particular reporting trips. And she sort of lays out this unbelievably intense, violent story. I mean, she's just telling me what it was like when she was 10. And she was also very lonely. She was very isolated at that point. So I was like this receptacle. And I didn't particularly want to hear this. I mean, there was no part of me that was like, this is story gold. It was, on some level, highly dramatic, and her telling of it was dramatic. And it involved her father's death, and her mother's death, and her rape, and this, and many things, all in a very short space. And then much more emotional for her were the more present tense family dynamics around sort of being orphaned and not having anybody to look after her, and where was she going to go when the house she was staying in, the old lady died, these kinds of things. I mean, everything came at me at once.
So how much of that did you use?
Well, the problem was when I walked out of there, I thought, I really don't necessarily want to put any of this in there.
Really?
Because it's so strong, and I'm not sure that it really adds to what where I was going with any of this. But now I feel a little bit like she told me this so that it would exist. Right? Part of what she was talking to me for was that nobody on earth came to her and asked her who she was and what was her life like. And she'd been given this little house, which was like the size of this stage, little mud brick house up on a hill through some government program with other survivor orphans. So it was like she'd been warehoused, she'd been stuck in a container up there.
But it's interesting that you made...
And I felt like, now I've got this thing. I now have this burden. It may not be, technically speaking, a responsibility, but I feel like I've got to figure out what I'm doing with this.
But it's also like deciding what, in a fictional book, this is not part of what I'm doing, or
right.
Not what
And that
I'm
happens all the time when you're reporting, and quite often you say, well, that's a great story. And I mean, I have reams of great stories that I picked up along the way reporting, and you say, well, that was a great day of hearing something, and maybe it filters into my understanding of what I'm writing, but I'm not going to give that character a chapter or a space or whatever it is. And this is somebody who's very closely connected to other, this is like somebody who was there when one of my main characters' family was getting killed. She is from that family. I mean, it was not disconnected. And she's very connected to the central killer I'm looking at in this very small community. That's the person who did all these things. And she even has an elaborate story where it's like, did he kill her father and then dispose of the body, or did he dispose of the father alive and leave him there to die, which is a completely different category of crime over there also. It's considered torture because you throw somebody like in a pit to die.
You're saying this, and I'm thinking about the question about titillating people, and in fact you're telling a true story here about violence, and that's something that happened that is so totally non-titillating. It was, and I kind of came to a halt for quite a while. I've gone back to see her. Luckily, she's by great good fortune. The last time I saw her, she was doing much better. It wasn't like any of these stories went away, but her own particular personal circumstances were less dire. And she just, even there were some inconsistencies in her story, and at one point she just said, well, I was in a terrible space back then. Basically my mind was not great, so maybe I did tell you some of those things. So it was complicated. I also was able to verify her version of the story over time. So it becomes integrated, and you start to find reporting ways to deal with it. But there are times where something is commanding of your attention because it involves so much violence, right? You sort of think like, well, I guess I have to recognize that. But man, it's going to make a mess of my... this is a lot to lay on anybody.
And did you put it in the work? Or did you
yeah,
not?
but I've spent a ridiculous amount of time fiddling with it and trying to find the right level of getting as close to it as she does, but sort of boiling it down and trying to find the right proportion for it. And
that's a fictional thing, though, right?
Yeah,
you're talking fiction now, because when you say
it's all the same.
Well,
it's
indeed,
writing.
But that's the thing. But people don't think that.
Right.
Like, people think, okay, well, there's nonfiction, which is real, and there's fiction, which is made up. And it could easily be, the other way around.
Well, the problem is I never would have made this up, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
right? That's the problem. Like, I got stuck with it because it's
but
real.
Editing it,
and now I have to figure out how to
But editing it makes it made up.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like you wouldn't make it up, but what you're doing is when you start moving it around, it starts to go into a fictional sphere, right?
And the inclusion or non-inclusion is based on your conscience in a way, because if I get an idea for a cool scene or character and it just won't fit, I wouldn't spend those hours trying to make it fit.
Right.
You just say, look, this was a really good idea, but it's no good.
And usually I wouldn't, but it's conscience, or it's like she moved
exactly.
me, like she hit me. Like,
Plus, she's real. That is
right,
a
and she
real
hit,
person.
like, in some weird way, she messed me up.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, she messed me up. That's something I got to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now what do I do with that? But I haven't really figured out how to keep her from messing up my book.
Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know at the time if we have time for another.
You're right. It's not a fiction.
Do we have another time for a question here? We need your microphone, though. No, we're out of time, or we are out of time. Yes.
Who says that?
This man in the shadows.
He's
Man in the shadows.
Man in the
the
shadows.
guy
I'd
running
say
his
attention to
fingers
that.
across
Who's
his
the
throat.
shadows? Oh, okay.
So
So
all
we're
right.
finished?
I think we are then.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
thank you, Philip Gourevitch. Good child. I hope you'll all get this book and support the ACLU and read great stories, see great pictures, listen to more of things that not necessarily violent at all. Thank you.